Hello, friends. Welcome back. Today I want to tell you a frontier story about a young woman whose quiet courage stood between two worlds and whose heart revealed the true cost of peace. This story begins in the year 1874. Out in the wide, unforgiving reaches of the Arizona Territory, fences were not lines of ownership, they were sparks for war. Peace, when it came at all, drifted through the land like a rumor carried by the wind. The country was harsh, untamed, and breathtaking in its cruelty and beauty. Yet beneath that beauty, fear smoldered. The cross-spur riders pushed farther into native, groundbreaking soil, where sacred paths once lay stretching wire across hunting land that had belonged to others long before memory could count. On the edge of that uneasy boundary lived a young woman named Ellen Rowe. She was 19, far too young to shoulder the weight life had already placed upon her. Her mother was gone. Her older brothers had been taken years earlier by fever, leaving only Elin and her father, Miles Rowe, to keep their modest ranch alive. Elin would never have called herself strong, but strength lived quietly in her. She rose before sunrise, milked the cows, cooked over a low fire, repaired broken fence rails, and hummed softly to the animals when storms rolled in. Her resilience was not loud or proud, it was steady, enduring. Beyond their land stretched a narrow river, a pale silver ribbon dividing the settlers' world from Apache ground. Some nights, when the wind carried just right, Elin could hear distant drums echoing through the hills. It made her wonder about the lives lived beyond that water, but she never asked aloud. Her father had warned her early. "Curiosity can get you killed, Ellen," he said. "Keep your eyes low and your heart guarded." Still she watched the horizon, always. Then came the months when fear drew closer than ever. Wagons were found burned in the valleys. Men vanished along trade routes. And when a neighbor was discovered dead beside his field, whispers hardened into shouts. The Apache were restless again, they said. Elin felt it in the air, a tension so sharp it turned every creak of the cabin into a warning. Miles Rowe began keeping his rifle within arm's reach. Even while eating, even while sleeping, he stopped singing, stopped laughing. His eyes took on the hunted look of a man who knew danger was closing in. One evening word arrived that a council had been called, a meeting between settler leaders and Apache elders to speak of peace. A truce, they claimed. One final chance to halt the bloodshed before it swallowed everyone whole. Miles Rowe was asked to attend, and because the land had grown too dangerous for a young woman to remain alone, Elin went with him. The gathering took place in a rough wooden hall built halfway between the fort and the river. The only ground both sides agreed was neutral. Elin sat quietly near the wall, hands folded in her lap, steadying her breath as voices rose and fell like crashing waves. The Red Bluff men stood proud and solemn, faces marked with paint, hair braided tight and gleaming under the sun. The settlers shifted uneasily, boots, tapping fingers hovering near gun belts. Between them, mistrust hung thicker than dust. For hours they argued. Burned homes, stolen horses, sons buried too young. Both sides spoke of peace, yet neither could forget the graves that lined the past. Then an older settler stood. His voice was worn but firm, and when he spoke it cut clean through the noise. "There will be no peace until we share blood instead of spilling it," he said. "Let there be a union, a marriage between our peoples. Let something living stand where the dead once lay." The room fell silent. At first Elin did not understand. Then she heard her father's name spoken softly, followed by one word more: daughter. Her heart stumbled. She looked up and saw Miles Rowe's face drain of color. His jaw drawn tight, lips pressed into a thin line. He was not offering. He was surrendering. Across from him, the Apache elder, Stone Bear, nodded slowly. Beside him stood a young man, tall, broad-shouldered, his dark eyes calm and unreadable. His name was Kestrel. They said he was a warrior known for honor, not cruelty. Miles Rowe spoke again, his voice cracking like dry timber. "If giving my child ends this bloodshed," he said, "then so be it. I would trade my own heart if it meant the killing would stop." Elin could not move. She could not speak. Her body locked in place as if the floor itself had claimed her. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears, drowning out the room. She wanted to shout no, to say she was not part of their bargain, not a token for peace. But when she lifted her eyes, she stopped. Every gaze in the room was fixed on her. Cross spur riders, Red Bluff men, elders. In that instant, Elin understood something with painful clarity. Silence was the last thing that still belonged to her, so she held it, and she said nothing. The agreement was sealed before the sun set. Kestrel the Apache warrior would take Elin Rowe as his wife. Their union would stand as proof that peace could exist where hatred once ruled. But to Elin it did not feel like peace. That night it felt like a sentence of death. Back at the cabin, she lay awake while Miles Rowe sat beside the fire, staring into the flames without a word. The light flickered across his exhausted face, carving lines deeper than years ever had. She realized he could not bring himself to look at her. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely more than breath. "This will save lives, Elin. Maybe even ours." She turned her face to the wall and cried without sound. Outside, the wind groaned through the cracks in the timber, carrying the smell of smoke and sagebrush. Somewhere beyond that, far across the dark river, waited the people who would soon be called her family. Strangers whose language she did not know, whose hearts she feared. Elin pulled the blanket tight around her shoulders. The life she had known, the freedom to hope to choose, was already slipping away. By morning, she would no longer belong to herself. As the first cold light crept through the cabin window, she whispered into the stillness, "If this is peace, then why does it hurt so much?" The wedding day arrived without joy. No laughter, no music, only the restless wind sweeping across the dry hills. To the cross spur riders, it was duty. To the Apache, it was symbol. But to Elin Rowe, it felt like a burial, the end of the life she once imagined. Miles Rowe barely spoke that morning. He helped load her small trunk onto the wagon, his hands trembling as he tied the ropes. Inside were her mother's worn Bible, a quilt sewn through endless winters, and a locket holding a faded photograph. The last pieces of the world that had been hers. As the wagon creaked toward the river, the thin line between her past and her fate, Elin felt each hoofbeat like a countdown. Her father kept his eyes forward, too afraid or too ashamed to meet hers. When they reached the open clearing where both sides had gathered, she saw him. Kestrel stood beside Stone Bear, tall and motionless. His expression revealed nothing. Sunlight caught the beads woven into his hair, and the air around him felt unnaturally still, as if the land itself had paused to watch. He did not look cruel, nor fierce, only calm, a calm so steady it made her pulse race with fear. The ceremony lasted only minutes. Words were spoken in two languages, one she understood and one she did not. Stone Bear draped a beaded cord across their joined hands. Miles Rowe's voice broke as he placed Elin's hand into Kestrel's. She wanted to pull away, to scream, but her body would not obey. When Kestrel's hand closed around hers, it was warm and firm, but never tight. Even so, it felt like iron. The wind kicked dust into the air as Stone Bear declared the union sealed. There was no applause, no cheers, only silence. "It's for peace," Miles Rowe whispered. "Elin." Then he turned, mounted his horse, and rode away. She stood frozen, watching him shrink against the horizon, until he became nothing more than a dark speck swallowed by light and distance. For the first time in her life, she was completely alone. Kestrel gestured toward his horse, offering his hand to help her mount. She did not take it. She climbed up on her own. She climbed onto the horse by herself, stiff with pride, even as her skirts caught and twisted around her legs. He said nothing. He simply turned and led the way through dry brush and winding trails, his back straight, his pace steady. Behind them, the last traces of the Cross Spur Riders' camp dissolved into dust. The ride to the Apache village stretched long and silent. Ellen's thoughts raced with questions she dared not speak. What kind of man was he? Did he resent this as deeply as she did? Would he harm her when night fell? By the time they reached the camp, dusk had settled over the desert. Low fires burned across the ground, casting amber light over the hides of the lodges. Dry River kids watched her with open curiosity, their faces glowing in the firelight. Nearby women of the sage circle murmured to one another, their eyes sharp but not cruel. The air smelled of roasted corn and smoke. Ellen's heart pounded at every sound, every glance. Every color felt unfamiliar. She wanted to disappear, to fade into nothing. Without a word, Kestrel led her to a small dwelling built of wood and hide. It was simple yet carefully kept. Inside, the air was warm, carrying the faint scent of sage and pine. Blankets were folded neatly along the ground. Tools hung in careful order. A fire pit sat ringed with smooth stones. It was nothing like the crude shelter she had imagined. It was quiet, almost gentle. He spoke a few words she did not understand, then pointed to a clay jug. Water, he said slowly, as if speaking to a child. She nodded, though she could not bring herself to thank him. He placed a folded blanket in her hands and gestured toward one side of the lodge. Then he moved across the room and sat down, drawing a small knife and sharpening it with a soft, steady rhythm. Only then did Ellen realize he was not going to touch her. The silence between them was heavy, but not threatening. She wrapped the blanket tightly around herself and turned away, trembling. She had prepared herself for violence, fed by the stories whispered by frightened settlers. But there was none. No anger, no cruelty, only patience. And somehow that frightened her more than anything else. Outside voices drifted softly through the camp, spoken in the Apache tongue, low, rhythmic, almost musical. She heard children laughing, the crackle of the communal fire night animals calling to one another beyond the circle of light. The world felt alive with sound, and she felt like a ghost moving through it. Kestrel spoke again, his voice calm and deliberate. He pointed to his chest. Kestrel. Then he gestured gently toward her. Ellen. She hesitated, then nodded. A small smile crossed his face, brief, restrained. It startled her all the same. She was not sure she had ever seen such quiet strength held within a single expression. That night, sleep came slowly. She lay beneath the woven blanket, watching firelight dance along the walls. Kestrel's breathing was slow and even. He slept several feet away, his shape outlined by dying embers. Each time the wind brushed the lodge, she flinched, expecting him to move toward her. But he never did. Hours passed. At one point, a dog barked outside, followed by laughter and the deep beat of a drum, perhaps a small celebration, somewhere else in the camp. Ellen closed her eyes, a tear slipping down her cheek. She thought of her father's cabin, of her mother's voice singing softly at dusk, of rain tapping against the tin roof. She thought of all the small, ordinary moments she would never know again. Then, without meaning to, she thought of Kestrel sitting by the fire, sharpening his blade. In silence, his dark eyes steady and unafraid. He had spoken few words, yet he filled the space with a dignity she could not explain. He had not looked at her as property, not even with pity, only as someone human. She did not know what to do with that, and part of her, despite everything, wanted to hate him. She tried to turn her fear into anger, to let resentment harden her spine, but something in his calm unsettled her as the fire sank lower. She whispered into the darkness, "I expected chains, and found patience instead." The wind shifted outside, carrying the scent of smoke and sage through the seams of the lodge. Ellen drew the blanket tighter around her shoulders, staring into the dying glow of the fire. She did not know it yet, but that night, the night she feared patience more than violence, was the moment her heart first began to change. Not toward love, not yet. Toward understanding, the smallest, most fragile step on a path that would shape her forever. Days passed. Then weeks, though Elin soon lost the ability to measure them. Each morning greeted her with the same sounds, the low murmur of voices beyond the lodge, the smell of smoke drifting on the air, the steady rhythm of wooden pestles grinding corn. The Apache camp moved with a harmony she could neither join nor fully grasp. Women of the sage circle laughed as they worked, hands swift and sure, their language rising and falling like song. To them the rhythm of life came naturally. To Elin it was music she could hear, but not sing. The food was unfamiliar. She had grown up on bread, salted pork, and potatoes, the plain comforts of a settler's table. Here meals were drawn straight from the land, roasted corn, venison, dried berries. The flavors were smoky and earthy, alive in a way she had never known. Still, every bite reminded her she no longer belonged to the world she came from. She tried to help. When the women gathered to grind corn or stretch hides beneath the sun, Elin offered her hands. But her clumsy movements earned quiet laughter. She dropped tools, tripped over her own feet, used the wrong implements at the wrong time. Their smiles were not cruel, but they cut her all the same. One morning, an older woman stepped forward and placed a bundle in her arms, a dress of soft buckskin, stitched with beads and fringe that caught the light as it moved. Elin understood enough to know it was meant as a gift, perhaps even a gesture of peace. But when she pulled it on, heat flared in her chest. The dress was beautiful, more beautiful than anything she had ever owned, yet wearing it felt like surrender. As though by wrapping herself in their ways, she had let go of the last thread of who she had been. Later that day, the village elder Asha approached her. Her face was lined by years, her eyes sharp yet gentle. She held out a small pendant, tiny turquoise beads, strung around a carved shell. Asha placed it carefully around Elin's neck while the others watched in silence. Elin felt its weight settle against her collarbone. To them it was welcome. To her it felt like a collar, a quiet declaration that she now belonged to them whether she wished it or not. That evening she sat alone beside the fire near her lodge, staring at the pendant as it glimmered in the flames. The beads caught the light and shone like trapped stars. Her hands trembled as she touched them. She despised herself for feeling both resentment and wonder. Then Kestrel joined her, settling a short distance away. He did not speak. He simply held out a small piece of flat bread he had baked over the coals. "Eat," he said softly. She hesitated, then took it. It was warm, smoky, faintly sweet. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and in that stillness something passed between them, unspoken, unnamed. After that, Kestrel began teaching her simple words. He pointed to the fire. Ta is Bikama, then to the sky, Yahate, then to his chest. Elin listened. His accent was rough, his English broken, but his patience seemed endless. She repeated the sounds awkwardly, earning a quiet smile each time she faltered. They spoke mostly without words, through gestures, nods, glances, small movements that bridged the silence between them. Somehow those fragments began to feel real. Still, the days were lonely. At times, Elin thought of fleeing back across the plains, back to the river that marked the edge of her former life. But where would she go? The thought of returning to her father's cabin, to the pitying stares of neighbors, filled her with equal dread. So she stayed, caught between two worlds, belonging to neither. And then came the day the snake appeared. It was late afternoon. The sun hung low and unforgiving, pressing heat into the earth. The air felt thick, heavy in her lungs. Elin Rowe had been sent to gather herbs near the edge of the camp, a task she accepted without question. It offered a few moments of solitude, and she clung to those moments as if they were rare coins. The ground beneath her boots was cracked and dry. Cicadas buzzed in the stillness. As she bent to pick a sprig of sage, she heard it, the sharp, unmistakable hiss. She froze. Only a few feet away, coiled among the rocks, a rattlesnake watched her with cold, patient eyes. Its tail shook once, then again. The sound rattled through her bones like a death warning. Her heart slammed so hard she could barely draw breath. Before she could move, a shadow flashed past her. Kestrel! He moved faster than her eyes could follow, his knife catching the dying light. One clean strike and the snake went still. Silence followed. Even the wind seemed to pause. Elin stood, trembling, unable to speak. Kestrel turned toward her, his gaze steady. He spoke softly in Apache words she could not understand, but the meaning carried through his tone. He touched her arm, light and brief, just enough to ground her. In that moment, she no longer saw him as her keeper, not as the enemy she had been raised to fear, but as a man who had stepped between her and death without hesitation. That night sleep refused her. The scene replayed again and again, the speed of his movement, the certainty of the strike, the way his hand trembled only after it was done. She thought of how close the snake had been, how narrow the line between living and dying truly was. And then she thought of him, of Kestrel. She turned the pendant slowly between her fingers, the one she had once believed was a chain. For the first time she wondered if it meant something else. Not ownership, but care. Not captivity, belonging. Her voice, quiet and unsure, slipped into the dark. He could have let me die, but he didn't. She did not yet understand it, but that single truth, the glimpse of the man beneath the stories, was the spark that would one day grow into love. Time in the Apache camp did not pass in days or weeks. It moved by necessity, by the carrying of water, the tending of fires, the long silent hours beneath an endless sky. For Elin Rowe, the fear that had once shadowed every breath slowly loosened its grip. In its place came something unfamiliar, softer, a silence that no longer felt like punishment. Each morning she saw Kestrel before dawn, his broad back bent as he carried water from the spring. The air around him was cool and silver with early light. At first she watched only from the doorway, uncertain whether she should follow. Then one morning he left a second jug beside the path and glanced back once. He said nothing. It was invitation enough. From that day on, they carried water together, walking side by side, their steps falling into an easy rhythm. The sound of their labor blended with the quiet murmur of the stream. Kestrel spoke little, yet his presence began to fill the spaces between her thoughts. When she stumbled over loose stone, his hand steadied her without pause. When she tried to thank him, he only nodded, as if kindness required no words. At night, when he returned from hunting or repairing tools, Elin found herself waiting near the fire, though she told herself it was only courtesy. She began to notice small details, the way he moved with deliberate grace, the faint scar near his temple, the patience etched into every line of his face. One evening he returned with a tear along his sleeve, a clean slice from a thorn bush. She motioned for him to sit and retrieved a needle from her small sewing box. He hesitated, clearly unaccustomed to being cared for. When she began to stitch the torn fabric, her hands steady against the coarse cloth, Kestrel remained still and silent. He did not pull away. He did not flinch. Firelight flickered across his skin, and for the first time, Elin Rowe allowed herself to meet his eyes. There was no command there, no pride, only a quiet gratitude that caught her off guard. When she finished the mending and handed the shirt back to him, he spoke softly. Good. It was only one word, yet it warmed her more than she wanted to admit. The space between them began to close in ways that could not be measured. They shared meals, bowls of stew passed without words, roasted corn eaten in companionable silence. At times their fingers brushed as they reached for the same dish, sending a brief spark through her fragile forbidden. In secret, Elin began learning more of his language. Late at night, after the camp had settled into stillness, She whispered the words he had taught her into the dark. Ta, fire, Kea, earth. Ayo aninishni. She did not yet know what the last phrase truly meant. Not completely. But she liked the way it felt round gentle, almost sacred. One afternoon, while gathering herbs near the communal fire, Elin heard laughter. Real laughter, bright and ringing, from the far side of the camp. She turned and saw Kestrel surrounded by Dry River kids. His hands worked carefully, carving small wooden animals from scraps of cedar. A young boy sat perched on his knee, watching as a horse took shape beneath the blade. When Kestrel placed it in the child's hands, the boy's face lit up and the others rushed forward, eager for their own. Kestrel laughed again, a deep, unguarded sound that rolled through the air like song. Elin froze. She had never heard him laugh before. In that moment, something inside her shifted. The man who had once been a stranger, someone she had feared, even resented, suddenly felt unmistakably human. His laughter held no arrogance, no threat. It was pure, uncalculated joy. The laughter of someone who still remembered how to be gentle even after the world had tried to harden him. She turned away quickly, pretending to adjust her basket, but the sound followed her all day. That night, as the fire burned low, she whispered to herself, "It was the sound I didn't know I was waiting for. The sound that told me he was more than a warrior." After that, the camp began to look different through her eyes. The same women who once whispered behind their hands now nodded when she passed. The same children who had hidden behind their mothers' skirts now ran to show her the toys Kestrel had carved. Slowly, almost without her noticing it happened, she began to belong, not because she was forced to, but because the life around her had started to pull her in. Kestrel noticed, though he never spoke of it. Sometimes in the soft stillness before nightfall, he looked at her, not with possession, but with recognition, as if he saw the battle still being fought inside her and respected her for standing her ground. Elin found herself wondering about his past, where he had learned such patience, what losses had shaped the weight of his silence. She longed to ask, but the words were not there. So instead she spoke with small gestures, offering him bread first at supper, resting her hand briefly on his shoulder when he returned from a long hunt. Small things. But in the desert, small things carry the weight of miracles. By midsummer, the fear that once lived in her chest had become something else. She still felt restless. She still missed the rhythms of her father's land. But when she looked at Kestrel, she no longer saw the line dividing their worlds. She saw a man who met the dawn with steady eyes, who worked without complaint, who laughed like thunder after years of silence. That night, lying beneath the woven blanket, Elin touched the small pendant resting against her skin. She remembered the day it had been placed around her neck, the day she believed it was a chain. Now, tracing its edges in the dark, she whispered, maybe it was never a chain at all, maybe it was a bridge. As the fire outside burned down to embers, Elin realized something she did not yet have words for. Her heart was no longer sealed shut. Whatever wall she had built inside herself, between duty and desire, between resentment and understanding, had begun to fracture. Thin cracks appeared, letting in just enough light for her to see what she had been refusing to name. By late summer, the land itself seemed to turn against them. The rains stopped. The grass crisped into brittle straw beneath every step. Each sunrise revealed a world more hollow than the day before. The river that once shimmered like glass now crept sluggishly through exposed stones, reduced to a tired ribbon of water. Crops shriveled where they stood. Even the wind arrived empty, carrying dust instead of scent, whispering across a land that seemed to have forgotten how to breathe. The Apache called it the season of thirst. To Elin Rowe it felt like hope being slowly undone. Hunger settled into the camp like an unwelcome guest that refused to leave. Children laughed less. Their ribs showed through thinning skin. Women whispered beside the fires, counting portions, scraping every grain from their baskets. The men left before dawn to hunt and returned with less each time. The game had fled north, chasing water that no longer lived here. Kestrel grew quieter than before. Each morning he rose ahead of the sun, bowed his head in silent prayer, then vanished into the wilderness with his bow slung across his shoulder. Some days he returned with a single rabbit. Other days, with nothing at all. Each time his face carried the same calm sorrow. Ellen came to understand that look as shame. For him, providing was not pride, it was purpose. And when he failed, the weight of it pressed heavier than hunger itself. One night, she watched him from the doorway as he sat by the dying fire, sharpening his knife in silence. The muscles in his arms tightened beneath the flickering light. She wanted to speak, to tell him this was not his failing, that no man could feed an empty earth, but the words would not come. Not in his language, not in her own. That night, lying awake as her stomach twisted and tightened, a memory surfaced, her mother's voice, gentle but firm. When the world gives you less, she had said, you make more from what remains. It was one of her mother's settler lessons. How to stretch flour with wild roots, how to dry fruit so it would last through winter, how to catch rain in every vessel no matter how small. Survival learned the hard way. The next morning, Elin joined the women near the cooking fires. They worked slowly, grinding corn, speaking in low voices, dulled by exhaustion. She watched for a moment, then gathered her courage. Using gestures and broken words, she showed them how to spread a thin layer of meal onto stones warmed by the sun, drying it until it became light as dust. She ground roots into the mixture, demonstrating how little could become more. They frowned, uncertain. But curiosity won. They let her continue. The first batch lasted twice as long as usual. The second fed 2 families instead of 1. When the women understood what she had done, they did not laugh this time. They listened. Day after day, Elin shared what her mother had once taught her: how to save scraps, how to catch dew at dawn, how to preserve what little they had. The drought did not break, but something shifted within the camp. Despair gave way to endurance. And for the first time, Elan's hands did not feel misplaced among theirs. She no longer stood apart, watching life from behind an invisible wall. Now she worked alongside them. When she walked through the village, the women nodded, not as the pale stranger brought by a treaty, but as one of their own, one of the circle fighting hunger together. One evening, Kestrel returned from another long hunt, his face streaked with dust. He dropped a small bundle of fish onto the ground, meager, but enough. As he settled by the fire, Elin handed him a bowl of stew she had prepared using her new method. Thin, yes, but rich with herbs and smoked corn. He took a sip, paused, blinked. Then he looked up at her, surprise clear in his eyes. "Good," he said slowly, his voice rough from thirst. And in that single word she felt something steady take root between them. He paused, then lifted his hand and pointed gently toward her chest, his gesture filled with quiet respect. "Good," he said. "Woman strong." The words were plain, almost spare, yet they struck Elin deeper than she could explain. In them lived gratitude, respect, something close to reverence, almost tender. She lowered her gaze, unable to meet his eyes. But she could not stop the smile that found its way to her lips. After that, their bond grew in the silence of necessity. From dawn until dusk, they worked side by side, repairing water traps, digging for roots, helping elders who could no longer stand for long. Sometimes, when exhaustion stole all words from them, Kestrel would look across the fire at her. In his eyes she saw the same quiet spark of pride. It said what neither of them spoke: "We endure this together." One night, as dust rode the wind through camp and the moon hung low and red against the cliffs, Elin sat awake, tracing the beads of her necklace. Each stone caught the faint glow of firelight, and she realized how many hands had touched it before hers. How many women had worn such tokens through storms, through birth, through loss. For the first time she felt its weight not as a burden, but as belonging. In the heart of drought, surrounded by hunger and fear, something unseen yet unbreakable, had begun to form between her and Kestrel. Not love, not yet. Something older, more human. It lived in shared labor, in the quiet comfort of being seen. When the first rain finally fell, only a thin drizzle that barely darkened the dust, the camp erupted in cheers, as if the sky itself had answered them. Elin tilted her face upward, letting the drops slide across her skin. Beside her, Kestrel lifted his hand, catching the rain in his palm. He turned toward her with a faint, knowing smile. For that brief moment, hunger and fear loosened their hold. What remained was enough. Enough to understand that love does not always begin with a kiss or a promise. Sometimes it is born in survival, in two hearts learning how to stand beneath the same storm. Autumn came quietly to the desert. The rains moved on, but the land remembered them. For the first time in months, the air carried the scent of green. Small shoots pushed along the riverbank, and the earth, once cracked and starving, began to breathe again. For Elin, row life settled into a rhythm she could finally read. She no longer woke at every sound. The laughter of the dry river kids became familiar music, and her hands, once clumsy, now moved in harmony with the women of the sage circle. She was still different, but she was no longer out of place. Kestrel's silence softened as well. At times he spoke her name easily now, as if it belonged on his tongue. They shared glances across the fire, a nod, a smile, a language that needed no words. But peace is fragile, too light to hold for long. It was a cool afternoon when the riders appeared. Dust came first, lifting into a pale cloud against the open sky, then the flash of metal, the low thunder of hooves. When Elin recognized the wagon at their center, her breath caught. It was her father. Miles Rowe looked older, thinner, his once straight posture bent beneath the weight of guilt. He appeared carved from sorrow itself. The camp stirred uneasily. The Red Bluff men reached for their weapons, uncertain of the settlers' intent. But when her father called out Elin, the tension fractured. The sound cut through her like a blade. She stepped forward slowly, her feet heavy, her heart torn between two worlds. Kestrel followed a few paces behind her, his gaze watchful but calm. Miles Rowe dismounted with effort, stumbling as he crossed the ground. When he reached her, he stopped short, his eyes searching her face as though afraid she might vanish. "Elin," he whispered again, his voice rough with emotion. "My God." And in that moment, the past caught up to the present. "You're alive." He reached for her hand, but Elin did not move. Her heart thundered so loudly it drowned out everything else. "I've come to take you home," Miles Rowe said. His voice was gentle, shaking at the edges, yet beneath it lay the familiar weight of command, the kind she had obeyed all her life without question. "You've done enough, Elin. You don't belong with them." The wind stirred the silence between them. Behind her, the women of the sage circle stood watching. Before her stood the man who had once been her entire world, waiting for her answer. She looked at her father, the same man who had traded her name for peace, who had believed love could be exchanged for safety. And for a brief moment she no longer saw the father who raised her. She saw a man ruled by fear. Then she turned to Kestrel. He stood still, silent, his dark eyes steady, unreadable. He did not step forward, did not speak, did not plead. He simply met her gaze with quiet resolve, as if to say, "This choice is yours." It was the hardest silence she had ever faced. Her throat tightened as she turned back to her father. "I can't," she said at last, her voice trembling but firm. "This is my home now." Her father's face crumpled as though the words had struck him in the chest. He shook his head slowly, tears filling his eyes. "No," he whispered. "No, you don't mean that. They've changed you. They've made you believe. They didn't make me anything." Elin interrupted softly. "I chose this. I stayed because I wanted to. Because," her voice broke, "because here I found who I am." The words settled between them, heavy with truth. Miles Rowe's shoulders sagged. He stared at her for a long moment, then turned away. When he climbed back onto the wagon, his hands trembled. He looked at her once more. His daughter, no longer the child he had tried to protect, but a woman he no longer understood. Then without another word, he rode away. Elin stood watching as the wagon shrank against the horizon, swallowed by distance. The ache in her chest was unbearable. But beneath the sorrow, something else took shape, something steady, something whole. Kestrel stepped beside her, his silence saying what words never could. She did not look at him yet. Her eyes remained fixed on the place where her father had disappeared, where her old life had finally ended. In the stillness that followed, she breathed a truth she could finally claim. "In that moment, I lost my father," she whispered. "But I found my own soul." The wind rose, carrying her words into the wide open sky. And for the first time since she crossed the river, Elin Rowe felt free. For a while. Peace held fragile as a spider's web, shimmering but thin. The harvest returned. The land breathed again. Life in the Apache camp moved with a quiet pulse of hope. Elin believed, perhaps foolishly, that the worst had passed. But peace on the frontier never lasted. It shattered too easily under fear, too quickly drowned in old blood. One cold morning, the horizon filled with dust once more. Angry voices rode the wind, sharp, desperate. By the time the warning reached the camp, it was already too late. Cross spur riders, dozens of them, armed, shouting, riding hard toward the village. They came hungry for vengeance. A nearby ranch had been attacked, and the Apache were blamed. No proof, no mercy, only rage. Chaos tore through the camp like wildfire. Women seized their children. Men reached for bows and rifles. And the fragile peace finally broke. The air thickened with gunfire. Shots cracked like splitting wood. Flames roared. Fear screamed its way through the camp. Elin Rowe's heart slammed against her ribs. She seized two small children playing near the riverbank and dragged them into the shelter of a lodge, her hands shaking as she pressed them down and whispered for silence. The ground quaked beneath pounding hooves and running feet. Outside smoke twisted upward, dark and merciless, the same smoke she remembered from the stories of old raids. Only now she was standing inside it. Then she heard it. Her name. Cutting through the chaos, through the gunshots and the cries, came a voice she knew as deeply as her own pulse. Her father's. Elin turned toward the sound, stepping into the open, just as the fighting surged around her. There he stood, rifle clenched in his hands, his face pale with fury and terror. When his eyes met hers, the world seemed to freeze. For a long, fragile heartbeat, neither of them moved. He did not see the girl he had raised. He saw a woman standing among those he had been taught to hate. Confusion and sorrow warred across his face. "Elin!" he shouted over the violence. "Get away from them! Come with me!" She shook her head, tears already burning her eyes. "Stop this, please!" she cried, but her words were swallowed by the roar of battle. Another shot rang out, sharp and close. The air filled with the choking bite of powder. Then one sound cut through everything, a single gunshot too near. Elin turned. Kestrel staggered, one hand pressed to his chest, his face drained of color beneath the dirt and smoke. The world tipped. Sound fell away. She ran to him before thought could catch her feet. Dropping to her knees, she pulled him into her arms as the chaos blurred into nothing. His blood was warm against her hands. Her breath came in the broken gasps. "Kestrel!" she cried, her voice tearing apart. "Kestrel, look at me!" He blinked slowly, his eyes finding hers through the haze of pain. His lips moved, but no sound came, only a weak breath trembling against her skin. Around them, the gunfire faltered. Settlers slowed, staring at the sight before them, the pale woman, cradling an Apache warrior, her hands stained with his blood, her face streaked with tears. It was too human, too raw. "I love you, Elin," whispered the words she had carried inside herself for far too long. Her voice shook, but the truth in it did not. "Do you hear me? I love you." Kestrel's eyes softened despite the pain. A faint, knowing smile touched his lips, the same smile that always reached his eyes first. I knew, he murmured, his voice barely breath. "I was only waiting for you to see." The world seemed to hold its breath. Even the wind stilled. Elin's tears fell onto his cheek, mixing with dust and blood. In that suspended moment, every boundary that had ever divided them, race, language, fear, fell away. What remained was simple: love. And somehow the others saw it too. The cross spur riders who had come to kill hesitated and began to lower their rifles. The red bluff men who had stood ready to die loosened their grip on their weapons. No one had won. No one had surrendered. They simply stood exhausted, hollow, watching the truth unfold before them. Miles Rowe stepped forward slowly, his rifle hanging uselessly at his side. He stared at his daughter, her arms wrapped around the man he had once called an enemy. Something inside him broke, not in anger but in understanding, the kind that arrives too late. He let the rifle fall to the ground. The sound struck the air like an ending. And just like that, the fighting stopped. No victory, no truce, only silence. Only stillness remained, the kind that settles when the heart finally understands what war can never claim. Elin Rowe pressed her forehead to Kestrel's, her voice reduced to breath. "Stay with me," she pleaded. "Please." He closed his eyes. His breathing was shallow but steady. Though pain ran sharp through his body, there was peace in his face, the peace of a man who had finally been seen. All around them, smoke drifted upward into a sky turning red with dusk. The guns were silent. The war for that moment was over. Not because someone surrendered, but because love had spoken louder than hate. In the hush that followed, Elin held him close, her heart breaking and mending at the same time. Morning arrived slowly over the desert, pale gold light spilling across the quiet land, touching the lodges, the river, and the wounded hearts left behind. The smoke of battle thinned into the cold blue of dawn. Beside a dying fire, Elin Rowe sat with Kestrel's hand in hers. He lived. The bullet had missed his heart by inches. Through the long hours of night, she never left his side, whispering prayers in two languages, holding on as if her will alone could anchor him to the world. When his eyes finally opened, faint but alive, she wept like rain returning to the desert. That morning, the camp moved softly. Every sound felt reverent. The Apache tended their wounded, and the cross spur riders, who had come to destroy, now helped rebuild what they had shattered. Some carried water, some buried the dead. In the midst of it all, Elin moved quietly, her hands steady, her heart stronger than it had ever been. Later, as the sun climbed higher, a lone rider appeared on the ridge, her father. Miles Rowe dismounted slowly, his face etched with grief and understanding. For a long moment he said nothing. Then, as he watched his daughter caring for the man he had once called an enemy, something in him softened. He nodded once, not in defeat, but in surrender to the truth. She had not chosen rebellion. She had chosen love, and love had done what all their fighting never could. That afternoon, the elders gathered beneath the wide open sky. No papers, no signatures, no hollow promises. Only tired voices speaking softly of loss of courage, of what peace should truly mean. When the words faded, every gaze turned toward Elin Rowe and Kestrel, the woman who had stayed and the man who had protected her, even when it nearly cost him his life. Their union stood as proof that two worlds could do more than meet. They could live as one. As the sun dipped behind the red cliffs, Elin and Kestrel stood together on the ridge. The wind lifted her hair, brushed his face, and carried the scent of sage and rain across the land. Below them, the earth stretched wide, not conquered, but shared. As their shadows merged beneath the fading light, her voice carried softly. Love didn't erase the scars of the frontier, she said. It healed them, one heartbeat at a time. And on that endless horizon, two souls who once belonged to different worlds stood beneath the same sky. If this story touched your heart tonight, my friends, share it with someone who still believes love can build peace where fear once lived. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from and which moment stayed with you the most. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my channel where every sunset still carries a story, and every story carries the heartbeat of the West. All stories are created for entertainment purposes and may include fictional elements or dramatized interpretations inspired by historical settings. We use AI tools, voiceover visuals, scripts as creative assistants. However, all content is reviewed, refined, and edited by humans to ensure emotional authenticity and storytelling quality. We fully comply with YouTube's policies regarding AI-generated content and do not use any deepfake techniques or misleading recreations of real individuals. All visuals and supporting materials are properly licensed. Sharing, re-uploading, modifying, or distributing any part of this content in any form requires written permission. We appreciate your support and respect for original creative work.